Thank you for the opportunity to present in this forum. As you were mentioning, you gave a brief bio, but I recently did depart from the CSIR. A lot of the information that I'll present here will be based on the work that I did whilst there. Maybe just a few updates. Unfortunately, in the last few months, we have been load shedding further, and yes, we're still in a lot of trouble. The power system still is in crisis, and we do need to recover as soon as possible. Any hope for a recovery post-COVID-19 will be dependent on that. So as much as possible, there is a lot of actions and decisions being taken. And I'll try to run through, if I just go to this next slide, looking back on the load shedding reality that we have had, and in more recent months, what we have seen. Looking ahead and planning for what least cost could look like into the future, the technologies that could inform that, and beyond, of course, in the long term. And then just one slide, just summarizing some key takeaways, and hopefully you've found it useful for your deliberations during today and tomorrow. So in terms of looking back, I'll look back very, very recently to the beginning of this year. This is really just a summary of the load shedding in 2021 so far. You'll see this is the first 6 months, January to June. The next slide actually talks to these last few months up until at least the last bout of load shedding, other than this last one in the last few days, where it just really summarizes, if you go from left to right, January to June, and then top to bottom, each of the days, each of the hours in each of those days. When we did not have load shedding, it's gray. When we had stage 1, it's sort of that light green. Stage 2 is a dark green, and you'll also see the yellow and the orange is stage 3 and stage 4. Luckily, if we could say that, for now we haven't seen stage 5, stage 6, or 7 or 8. This is good to know. Ideally, we would want this to be completely grey. Of course, we wouldn't want to be seeing any level of load shedding, but we have seen load shedding at the beginning of the year, as well as when we went into the end of the first quarter, a small amount during April and May, but then quite a large amount of load shedding during June. As we'll then see in this next slide here as well, the last bout of load shedding now in October was quite an extended amount of load shedding for quite a few days at stage 2. And remember, in terms of the stages, stage 1 being 1,000 megawatts, stage 2, 2,000 megawatts, 3, 4, 5 onwards, it's 1,000 megawatts, or at least estimated to be about 1,000 megawatts at a time. It's not exactly like that. It always works out slightly different. And I'll also talk through that in a few of the slides to come, to just present some of those technical realities of trying to manage the power system and the supply-demand balance in real time. And as you mentioned already, Gav Herford will be presenting a lot of the technical details, as he is literally at the coalface every day, making sure that the system is balanced. So summarizing and now looking a lot further back, not just this last year, but all the way back to 2007, 2008, where if you just look on the left-hand side here, it's the hours of load shedding that we've seen. On the right-hand side, it's the megawatt hours. So you could think of the left-hand side, of course, being the amount of time that we've shed load. On the right-hand side, the intensity of that load shedding. The colors very similar to the previous graph, just except for in 2007 and 2008, there isn't actually as much data available. So it's really just estimated by NERSA. So that's based on NERSA information. The really worrying trend, though, is that in the last 3 years, we've seen the highest amounts of estimated load shedding, at least an upper limit of that, for 3 years in a row. Unfortunately, in 2020, it was a lot higher than in 2019. Even though we did have that COVID-19 induced lockdown as we went into lockdown to manage the pandemic that we've been going through and still are going through. In 2021, we've already shed up to 1,556 gigawatt hours. Estimated this is an upper limit, so it will be slightly lower because of that estimation that I was talking about previously. And we're just about 85, I think, % of the way through the year. So also shedding quite a lot of load, unfortunately, looking like we are going to get towards 2020 levels again, potentially higher. I hope not, and we do hope not. I was actually just reading before we started this session, the Eskom system operator is going to be presenting the system status reports this morning. If they're not already, I think they are actually doing it right now. And the outlook also doesn't look very good in terms of the need to then run more of the open cycle gas turbines. So the system will be constrained if there are going to be higher levels of unplanned outages on the supply side, which they're highlighting is a very real possibility. So we are most definitely not out of the woods. There are a lot of supply side interventions that are coming into play, and I'll talk to that in the next few slides. But it's still going to be a bit more pain before we get into an adequate power system over the next 2 to 3 years. And this is just something I wanted to demonstrate from recent work, a very technical slide, but I'll try and walk you through it in a bit of detail, looking at two numbers. The breakdown of the energy availability factor into these two parameters. One is called the PCLF, or the planned capability loss factor, so the planned outages that Eskom take to maintain the plant, as well as the unplanned component of that, or the unplanned capability loss factor, otherwise known as sort of breakdowns that are not planned for, and they necessarily obviously have to try to get the units up as soon as possible, but something that you don't plan around. And I've intentionally shown on the left-hand side the data that's available thus far, up to the back to 2017, 2017, 18, 19, and 20, as well as this year to date. And then the bottom right-hand curve being a combination of all of them. The real worrying part of this is, although we've seen an equal level of planned and unplanned outages historically, you can see 2017, 2018, but as we progress towards 2019, and maybe if we remove 2020 because of the exceptional period that we had during the level 5 lockdowns that we saw, if you look at 2021, you can really see a separation of the planned and the unplanned into two distinct distributions, where you'll see the sort of dual distribution of the unplanned outages in 2020, but really increasingly moving of the unplanned component, that orange distribution, to the right-hand side and to higher levels, greater than 10,000 megawatts. And this really has shown a distinct separation in the first half of 2021 already. So you can really see that coming through there. And like I was saying, I'm just looking through the system operators' system status reports, and they're saying exactly the same thing. And that's a worrying trend, because the unplanned part of the outages are now higher than the planned parts of the outages that don't necessarily have space to do the planned maintenance, and the unplanned outages are now getting worse and worse. As the old adage goes, if you don't plan to do your maintenance, your equipment will plan it for you. This seems to be what is happening, unfortunately, and specifically on certain components of the coal fleet, which is heading in this sort of worrying direction, where that orange part, as I was mentioning, is moving towards the right-hand side. If you just look at the bottom right curve there, you'll see that distribution then over the last 4 to 4.5 years shifting towards the right, even when you average it over the entire period. So this is just now going to try and show how and why load shedding happens, specifically recently, how it's happening. And I've just tried to highlight that red part there. This is from the 17th of September this year up until the 12th of October. I haven't managed to get more recent data from Eskom. It's available actually for anyone who's interested on their public data portal, an excellent resource to find exactly what's going on the power system, and a really good, transparent place to go find that kind of information. So this is an hourly, and you'll see hourly for in the order of about a month. It's about 4 weeks of data. You'll see all of the different colors is essentially a stack plot of the different technologies, from the coal to the nuclear at Coburg, to the imports in purple, to the solar PV, wind, as well as CSP, our pump storage, as well as hydro. And then more importantly, which is what I'll talk to next, is the open cycle gas turbines that are fueled by diesel distillate fuels. And if you look there towards the beginning of October, that area that I've highlighted in red, you'll see that the week preceding that, there was a small amount of the open cycle gas turbines that needed to be run, but for the most part, the combination of the coal, the dispatchable capacity, the open cycle gas turbines, the pump storage, as well as the renewables, as well as the nuclear and the imports were able to supply load. You'll see as you head into that week, the coal fleet is really utilized at its maximum capacity, and it actually starts to decline towards the end of that week if you look at the 6th, 7th, and 8th of October. And the filling of that gap is then filled by that sort of light cream to brown color, which is a combination of the Eskom open cycle gas turbines, as well as the IPP open cycle gas turbines. They can only run for a certain amount of time though. Similarly, the pump storage can also only run for a certain amount of time. They are energy constrained resources. The reason for that is mostly fuel handling for the open cycle gas turbines, and obviously for the pump storage, there's only so much water that will be kept in the upper reservoirs until you use it all. And thereafter, you see when you get towards the 9th and towards the 10th, 11th, towards the end of that week and going into the next week, where that sort of red color comes into it, which is called MLR, manual load reduction, which is essentially the parlance for the load shedding that needs to be done to then balance the power system. And you'll see during those periods, the coal fleet really fell away and is only able to supply in the order of about 18 to 20,000 megawatts of capacity during that period. You'll see towards the end of that week there, it starts to recover in terms of what it can supply. And that's what I'm showing in this curve. If we really zoom in on it, you can then see how during those very high demand, or relatively speaking, higher demand periods during each of the days, you run the expensive gas turbines, but you can only run them so much. There's only so much fuel that's available. Similarly, on the 9th and the 10th and the 11th there, you'll see that the dark blue, the pump storage, or PS, is only able to be run for a few hours in each of those days because you are running out of water. There's only so much water that you have, and therefore that load shedding needs to be done for extended periods during just this period shown. So this just gives you an idea of sort of how the system is balanced and why we therefore need to load shed, and the real issue being that of energy constraints and the capacity then coming off the grid because of the coal fleet EAF dropping, or at least the outages increasing, and therefore being required to balance the system with the manual load reduction. You'll also see a small amount, for example, at the end of the 11th of October there, just as an example of demand side response, that darker red, and that's essentially industrial load reductions that happen that are contracted for by Eskom in order to also try and balance the system just for those 1 to 2 hours in those evening peaks when the demand is quite a bit higher. You'll see also quite importantly that certain days you do get a lot of supply from your variable renewable energy, from your solar, from your wind, as well as CSP. And then in some of the other days, you do get a lot less supply. Budgeting for that in terms of the energy budget and making sure that you can do that forecast is something that the system operator does continually. But you cannot budget and plan for unplanned outages. When those happen, you need to be trying to balance the system as much as possible with that peaking resource, with the open cycle gas turbines, as well as then with the demand side, unfortunately, in our case, in the form of load shedding. I wanted to just talk quickly now through an international example of Texas earlier this year. Even in a very developed power system like Texas, when you have large amounts of supply capacity that's lost off the grid in an unplanned manner, which is what I was just trying to explain in the previous few slides, you do have to manage the demand side as a result of that. This is a reality that you have to deal with. Here is an example where, and I'll show you in the next slide as well, where in Texas, you'll see as they headed towards the 14th of October, end of the 14th of October, the electricity demand was forecasted to peak, to hit record peaks in their jurisdiction. What they had to actually do though, because temperatures dropped quite significantly into that evening, as they got to about 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock in the morning, they realized that they were also starting to see a large amount of their supply capacity going offline. Interestingly enough, all of the supply capacity, or a very big, not all of it, a very big dominant component of that supply capacity that went offline was thermal capacity, mostly in the form of gas that wasn't necessarily weatherized to deal with that cold weather. They lost a lot of supply capacity at the same time and actually had to load shed for an extended period of time in the order of 4.5 days. But for them, this was unheard of. For us, we've seen this for many, many days and actually many years still. So a bit of tongue in cheek here, I guess, is what I'm trying to say, is that managing the demand side and the supply side is not easy. But interestingly enough, we could probably teach them something in managing our demand side. And I'll show that now in this next slide. And I mean that tongue in cheek, but in all seriousness, they went from, you'll see there at about 20 past 1 in the morning, they shed 1,000 megawatts, and their system frequency was still starting to drop. They lost a lot of generation. They're starting to detail that there, as you can see. But in the space of 40 minutes, they shed in the order of about 15,000 megawatts of generation. And you'll see the system frequency, which is essentially a measure of the balance of the system, really dropping to below critical levels. One of those critical levels that they define in Texas, which we do similarly in South Africa, is an area below there called 59.4 hertz. Okay, they work with 60 hertz, we work with 50 hertz. But they were below 59.4 hertz for 4 minutes and 23 seconds. If they did that for another 4.5 minutes, the entire Texas system would have been in a complete blackout. They were literally 4 minutes and 30 seconds away from a blackout. Now, I won't be able to say it by personal experience, but I can tell you with a certain level of confidence that it's very likely that we have entered into very significant frequency deviations in our power system in managing it. And you don't know what you don't know, but the system needs to be balanced in a certain way. And managing the demand side is one way in which you have to do that. If, as you saw in that previous slide, supply capacity really falls away quite quickly, and you have to essentially, in inverted commas, save the system. You'll see there right at the end of when they got to that minimum frequency of 59.3, They shed another 3,500 megawatts of load and started to recover the frequency back, shed another 2,000 megawatts after that to make sure. And still, even after that, supply capacity started to come back over the next few days, but took in the order of about, as I was saying, 4.5 days for the system to recover and for supply capacity to come back online. So that was just looking back and looking at a bit of an international example of how load shedding happens everywhere, and load shedding or demand side response is something that can be planned for, but also a lot of the time isn't necessarily planned for and is more an emergency measure. Now, looking ahead and planning for least cost and beyond, there was some work that we did whilst I was at CSIR, where we really just defined it into 3 steps. And I won't go through this in detail. A lot of you are aware of this. The work has been published before, but I just thought I would present this here for your deliberations and an update of it. 3 steps: a customer response at scale. The chair was talking earlier to this immediate focus on updating the licensing threshold to 100 megawatts. That is very welcome, and it should be. There's immediate potential and immediate impact that can be seen by that. We added in the order of about 1,000 megawatts already in 2020, just in terms of embedded generation. But of course, further assistance from this will also be seen in 2021 and 2022, because the licensing threshold wasn't even there in 2020. So we will probably be seeing quite a big response there. But of course, there will need to be the requisite institutional capacity and the requisite streamlining of regulatory processes, which I'm sure others will also talk to in the coming hours and during the course of the sessions tomorrow, to talk about making sure that those processes are streamlined to get this capacity licensed, registered or licensed, and of course then onto the grid as quickly as possible. And then in terms of step 2, there was talk of the risk mitigation power procurement program. This should and could assist but it needs to be designed in the best manner possible. There's potential for making sure that this gets slightly augmented to really make sure it meets system needs as much as possible. There have been some delays in terms of getting financial close for a lot of this capacity. Unfortunately, there's been a few legal challenges around the process. So without getting into too much of the detail, the reality from a power systems perspective is that capacity might be delayed in terms of when it is actually able to deliver megawatts onto the grid. So just to say there, the capacity is likely to be online from 2022 or late in 2022 at the earliest. To be honest, it's more likely in early 2023 by the looks of where the process is at the moment. And this will assist with that additional dispatchable capacity, with the additional energy into the grid to then assist with the reduction in load shedding. And of course, at the same time, all of these things need to be done in parallel. Implementing of existing policy, that's the IRP 2019, an immediate focus on further ministerial determinations. There have been a few already. We mentioned the storage determination, renewable energy in the form of solar PV and wind. There's likely to be deliberations around gas capacity, further storage, as well as even additional renewable energy. It's critical that we get more and more fresh kilowatt hours, new capacity onto the grid to make sure that we give the space to Eskom to do the maintenance that they need to do and not run the plants as hard as they need to be run, which then also gets you into this terrible cycle of utilizing the plants harder, running them harder, and therefore also having more and more unplanned outages to deal with. So just to mention there that the first capacity from the IRP is likely only from 2023 onwards. We're in 2021, as you know, towards the end of 2021. So we actually need it next year. So we should be expecting still a very constrained power system, high risk of load shedding. And as I was mentioning at the bottom of the slide here, that if the EAF, the energy availability factor, does not recover towards those IRP levels of in the order of the upper 70s, 75%, we are going to be seeing shortages for quite some time still, unfortunately. This is a function, of course, of the other steps and how quickly we can get other capacity online as soon as possible. But we do need to be doing all of this in parallel. It's not a one or the other, it's all of them at the same time. So in the long run, of course, this all aligns with long-term build-out of new renewable energy capacity, new dispatchable capacity. This is work that we did recently in terms of understanding, becoming more and more ambitious on carbon dioxide emissions and a decarbonized power sector and a cleaner power sector. You can see that that dispatchable capacity, we just called it in the analysis we did peaking. It's really just capacity that needs to be flexible. It could be in the form of natural gas, thermal generation. You could even get it in the form of demand-side response. You could get it in the form of open cycle gas turbines that still run on liquid fuels. potentially even post-2030 that run on hydrogen or ammonia and other types of fuels that are produced via renewable energy, so electrolytically formed hydrogen, and then building, of course, on what our hydrogen economy could look like. You'll also see a large role for storage there. Storage has a role. It doesn't play the only role. And similarly, as I've been mentioning already, renewable energy also has a role, but does not play the only role. It's about the mix and making sure that the system is balanced and adequate in the long run to make sure that we then can actually grow the economy as intended. So just to talk about a few key takeaways, I've just listed 6 here. Unfortunately, the load shedding that we've seen historically has become systemic. It's been over 10 years. It's in the order of 14 years at the moment. The past 3 years have been the most intense load shedding years that we have seen. I've just listed some of those numbers there for reference. There's various interventions that I've been talking to that are being implemented, but these will take time. This includes renewable energy, it includes storage, it includes potential other thermal dispatchable capacity in the form of gas and potentially even new coal capacity that's still in the RP. The easing of the embedded generation and distributed generation licensing will assist. That assists right now. But of course, as I was mentioning, those processes, the regulatory processes need to be streamlined. And of course, the institutional capacity needs to be bolstered to make sure that we can deal with all of these applications that are going to be coming to the likes of NERSA, to the likes of Eskom, as well as municipalities. I spoke briefly to the risk mitigation IPP program as well, but it is at risk of further delays, and therefore further load shedding does seem inevitable. This is a really high risk of happening for the next 2 to 3 years. But again, as I was mentioning, it's a function of how much we can scale those other steps that I was talking through in the last few slides. So it is critical then in the long term, as it aligns with those long-term build-outs, to accelerate the build-out of the now very well-known least cost mix of solar PV, of wind, and that flexible capacity that I was talking to, of course being complemented by the existing coal capacity as it's decommissioned in a controlled manner over the next decades to come, as we then transform, of course, and I just mentioned here, an energy-rich and cleaner and thriving energy sector in South Africa in the long term. So that's all I have to contribute today, and hopefully you do find that helpful. I'll hand back to the chair now and stop sharing my screen. Thank you.